Hi, everyone. Welcome to our presentation today on building a winning strategy to hire the top talent. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day and joining us on this topic. I'm Ahryun, CEO and one of the co-founders of GoodTime. GoodTime is the hiring experience platform that automates and helps scale interview scheduling and interview training, so your candidates have amazing experience meeting with a diverse set of well-trained interviewers. Our agenda this morning is that we'll meet today's speaker, Mawulom Nenonene, Head of Talent for LTSE. So Mawulom will go through his two-part method on how to create an efficient as well as inclusive hiring strategy to hire the best talent, like the ones he and his team created for LTSE. So Mawulom takes a two-part approach to this strategy. So we'll pause for a few minutes at the end of part one, and also to take some questions. Also, we'll pause for a few minutes at the end of part two to take additional questions. So please submit all your questions throughout the talk, and we'll get to as many as we can. We have an amazing gift, by the way, from Mawulom. It's a one-page tool for you to write a winning job description. We'll send it out in a follow-up email. So be sure to keep a lookout for this in your inbox. So this is I love checklist, because checklist is really the way for you to continuously improve upon your process and not reinvent the wheel over and over again. So this is amazing that Mawulom is willing to share the work that he and his team put together in order to make every job creation completely bulletproof and amazing. So LTSE CEO is Eric Ries. I wonder if anyone is familiar with the book that he wrote. The hint is that it's the textbook, Holy Bible of Silicon Valley startups. If anyone knows, put it in your chat box. So the book is called The Lean Startup. I've read it along with all of my founder friends. Really, the gist of it is setting hypotheses, using data to prove or disprove, and then you iterate on it to make it better. So the entire company, including Mawulom's team at LTSE, takes this approach to heart. So his recruiting team sets hypotheses at the beginning of every quarter, and then proved or disproved them throughout the quarter using the data, and use that learning in the next quarter to iterate on it. Iterate on the processes continuously to improve them. So the checklist is the outcome of such continuous iterations. It's proven, time-tested, battle-tested. I think it'll help a ton of people and you'll absolutely love it. So please keep a lookout for the checklist. And with that, without further ado, I'd love to introduce you to today's speaker, Mawulom Nenonene, Head of Talent at LTSE. Please take it away, Mawulom.
Ahryun, gratitude for the thoughtful introduction, and peace and blessings to you all and everyone joining today. Thank you for creating a space for us to just connect. So I'm Mawulom, as Ahryun said, the Head of Talent at LTSE. And LTSE is one of the newest US national securities exchanges on a mission to accelerate the transition to a new form of capitalism. We create capital markets infrastructure that prioritizes companies and their impact with employees, shareholders, and society. What that means is that we are building a 21st century exchange and powerful software. As the Head of Talent at LTSE, I am responsible for building hiring systems for equitable, sustainable, and scalable hiring. Putting a system like this in place is an all-company effort. Thankfully, I'm fortunate to partner internally with a smart, compassionate, and dynamic group of people to bring this to life. But what I'm most passionate about is meaningful connections and enabling people to live out their professional dreams. So today, I'd like to share what we've learned. I'll provide insights into the hiring practices we've designed to support our team's needs. I'll dive into our current hiring process, which is a culmination of work by our team and years of experimentation and iteration. AKA a few lessons we learned the hard way. As Ahryun mentioned, we work in a cycle of experimentation. Our cycles, our quote unquote quarters, are essentially 8 weeks, 1 week of planning, 6 weeks of experimentation, with a midpoint check for pivot or persevere, whether we're going to continue or we're going to leverage the data to move in a different direction, and then a week to retrospect. During this conversation, I'll share actionable steps we've taken to embed DEI into our hiring process. It's important to note that our work in DEI, specifically within talent, is merely a small part of a larger whole. At LTSE, DEI is embedded into our organizational culture. It's not an isolated program, but rather a core value, a source of innovation, and a means to growth and success. I'll share strategies for top of funnel sourcing and how we use process to foster mindsets that keep representation top of mind. Okay, part one. Before we dive any further, I'd like to take a moment to highlight the value of talent professionals. To all of the talent professionals out there that have joined this session, whether you're a head of talent, recruiter, sourcer, talent lead, or the many variations of that name, if you're responsible for identifying and qualifying candidates and shepherding them through their career transition, it puts you in a unique position to influence the lives of many. As talent professionals, you are coaches, mentors, cultural catalysts, and leaders. Most importantly, you are gatekeepers of life-changing opportunities that affect wealth generation. And for some underrepresented communities, this impact can be exponential. It's important to me that we highlight this contextually, as we are key professionals and we can have tremendous impact in hiring practices. So at LTSE, launching a new role begins with confirming available headcount and allocated budget for a new position tied to a specific organizational goal aligned to OKRs. We start by working through a role template. This is the document that Ahryun shared, and essentially has 7 sections: the requirements, kickoff, sourcing, coordination, interview, pre-founder, and role closing. To track completion of the process, the template includes columns for tasks, status, and DRI, which stands for directly responsible individual. Being a DRI means you own and are accountable for a specific section. We use this document to translate the needs of the hiring managers into actionable steps and also maintain the structure required for consistent and bias-reduced hiring. Okay, this document becomes a central source of truth for each position. And partnering with hiring managers, we detail the goals of the role. What is the intended impact of the position? And then from there, we align on the deliverables. What does the new hire have to deliver to meet those goals? And then we work through the skill sets. What expertise does the person need to have to deliver effective work? These are the key elements we find make the most successful hires. You might wonder where education fits in. We do value education, of course. What we seek is not only an educational milestone, but to understand what the person has retained from that educational experience. We're less focused on how or where they learned what they did, and more on what they absorbed. Skills-based hiring adds a fresh dynamic to recruiting. It requires that we get a sense of a candidate's ability to perform the duties of the role and focus less on their educational achievement. If a candidate can get into and complete their formal degree in a top-tier school, that's phenomenal, because it's no easy feat. But if not, we found that those who are self-taught or have gone through alternate routes to learning skills have the grit, resourcefulness, tenacity, and bias towards action and self-awareness that the fertile grounds of life's challenges allow you to develop. And over the long term, these qualities can be equally as valuable as formal education. Okay, the importance of representation. As part of the role template, the hiring manager and talent team, we also align around other dimensions of the role. Specifically, we ask which viewpoints, experiences, and backgrounds are missing from the team. These actionable steps support this effort. Whether your company is already steeped in DEI or has just begun to work, asking these questions in your role launch adds real value. We want to engage hiring managers to evaluate their team as a whole, identify the voices that are missing, and make representation top of mind. Since our ultimate goal is not simply to fill headcount, but to build high-performing teams, we take the time to discuss the sorts of viewpoints, backgrounds, and experiences that a new hire could bring to elevate the team. This is where we define representation. We talk through the current team's chemistry, expertise, and opportunities for growth. With our addressable market in mind, we then align on the outward manifestations of representation that are missing. Okay, why is this important? I hope most of you have seen this type of research in one way or another. If you haven't, I'm happy to provide more insights. But there are three key things that I want to highlight here. One, Gartner's research. It indicates that 75% of organizations with frontline decision-making teams reflecting a diverse and inclusive culture will exceed their financial targets through 2022. In their research, gender diverse and inclusive teams outperform gender homogeneous, less inclusive teams by 50% on average. The McKinsey study continues to show the likelihood that teams with diversity in ethnicity will outperform those that have higher diversity. Lastly, the Deloitte survey. Oh, hold on. I skipped over that really quickly. For the McKinsey study, one thing I want to highlight there is that the likelihood of our performance is higher for diversity in ethnicity than for gender. The Deloitte study is the most compelling. It shows that 83% of millennials reported higher levels of engagement when they believe their company fosters an inclusive culture, and that engagement leads to output and leads to increase in retention. Now for the fun stuff. Let's talk about the actual job description. Translating the requirements into a job description that will effectively share our opening is essential. To enable this, we created a standard format for our job descriptions, which we revise and update for regular role openings. Questions to consider. Do you review your job descriptions for inclusion? Do your job descriptions prioritize skills-based hiring? Lastly, do your job descriptions distinguish between must-have versus nice-to-have skills? These are key elements. We prioritize skills-based hiring. We clearly distinguish between required skills versus nice-to-have, and we avoid jargon and exclusionary terms. You might be wondering how you can do this. Well, 3 resources to support your efforts. First, Hemingway Editor. It reduces excessive wording and supports clarity. Texio provides language guidance with analytics that uncover bias and can infuse your talent with language of belonging. Matheson.io. I love the folks at Matheson. Their tool analyzes job descriptions and communications for bias and exclusionary terms. All of this is designed to allow the job description, which is essentially the first hello, to reach the appropriate person. The analogy I like to use is, imagine you're speaking to someone that speaks a different language. Using these tools and ensuring that you create the ideal job description allows you to communicate effectively to the other person. Okay, before we move to part 2, I want to pass it back to you, Ahryun, so you can lead some Q&A and address some of the questions.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Folks in the audience, please submit your questions now. And in the meantime, actually, I have some questions. So job description, in checking the job description for inclusivity, I think it's definitely a must-do item. My question kind of starts with some basics. Who writes job description in LTSC? Is it recruiting teams, or is it hiring managers, or is it a collaboration between those two stakeholders?
It's a phenomenal question. So we've actually developed a template, and the template has some interchangeable pieces. So for the hiring description, for the job description itself, the hiring manager provides a scope, a role scope. And then from there, we leverage the details that we've gathered through the role template to create the remainder of the job description. And then we share it through our team, through our networks to get feedback. Yes, I shared 3 tools that you can use, but ideally, we love to get real life feedback on our job descriptions prior to actually shipping them.
Awesome. Then it's really collaboration between hiring managers and the recruiter who's in charge of the job rec. Then I think what's really interesting is about the conversation that happens between the hiring manager and the recruiter, especially on a few things that you mentioned. Number one is goals. It's really interesting that you actually define the goals that this new hire has to achieve to be considered successful within the job description. I think that's a very different way to think about job description, because usually job descriptions are very, very vague, right? It definitely comes from more, the job descriptions, typical job descriptions that I've seen have been really vague, but putting the goals that they have to achieve, I think it just makes it really, really objective and very clear what this new hire will be, the challenge that this new hire will be kind of overcoming and achieving, accomplishing, and so on. Tell me more about the goals. Are they numerical goals? Like, how do you advise other teams that are looking into making job description more concrete, go about setting goals that you can put into job descriptions?
That is a phenomenal question. So in terms of the goals, deliverables, and skill sets, that framework is what we use to align on the back end before we actually launch the role. And it allows the hiring team, as well as the interviewers, to align on what we need for the role. And the goal actually turns into a short synopsis of what the role is, which goes above the skill sets and the nice to haves. So in terms of the recommendation, I suggest really thinking about the dynamics of your current team and leveraging this nuanced conversation that you describe it as a way to further calibrate your team, to bring them in and to have clarity. Keep in mind that by getting clarity on the goals, the skill sets, as well as the deliverables, this not only affects your ability to qualify candidates, but allows you to actually bring them on and streamline their experience. And this is where the high performing comes in. We're seeking not just to hire, but to build high performing teams. So by providing clarity on both sides of the market, it enables us to nurture environments that cultivate bringing out the best in each other.
Definitely. And then I think we have some questions that were submitted. So the question is, if a hiring manager identifies a missing voice on their team of a non-visible, underrepresented group, how would one go about reaching that group? So an example would be a hiring manager wants to tap into the LGBTQ community or the neurodivergent community, which probably LinkedIn profiles or resumes wouldn't necessarily reflect. How would you go about and reaching out to that group so that you can have that inclusivity, including those underrepresented group as well?
That is an excellent question. Given that you've done the hard work to actually identify this as a missing voice, I consider looking at your environment, looking at the market that you serve and the communities that your organization exists in. If you are a fast-paced startup and you're lacking resources when it comes to time, think about partnerships. You can partner with groups like Matheson.io and they have built authentic relationships with a large number of underrepresented communities. And what they'll do is not only surface candidates and share your job posting, but they can allow you to partner with these communities to build programming. It's not enough, in my mind, in terms of long-term partnerships, to simply share your job posts. But I believe creating a relationship with that community is value added for both sides. And one, it allows you to show the community that you care. And number two, it allows you to actually embed yourself in that community. So the quick answer, looking at organizations that already have established relationships and reaching out to them to gain that access.
Oh, definitely. And the last question before we move on to part two. This is a very real life kind of business decision question. I really love this question. For a smaller company, maybe less than 300 employees or all around their employee sites, does it make sense to invest in resources such as text.io, medicine, or instead, should we use that budget to recruit people with the background in DE&I to implement new processes?
That's a really good question. And I go back to the structure that you have in your organization. So I didn't cover this in detail, but prior to opening a role, we think about the overall goals of the position. So if your goal is to get this output, which is an updated job description as well as relationships, there are many ways to do that. Looking at your funding and your budget, then you can begin working through how and when to best trigger that. For example, if for this fiscal year you only have, let's say, 40,000, that may not be enough to hire an expert, but it will be enough to actually identify these other communities and tools to help build and bridge the gap until you are able to actually fund an individual internally to do this work. That said, there are a number of free resources that you can actually leverage to build inclusive job descriptions. Over the past 12 months, a number of these free resources have converted into subscription models, but I'm confident that with a bit of work, you'll be able to find resources that allow you to make this happen. And the old adage of copying is the best compliment. I'm not sure if that's the way it translates into English. English is my second language. But look for organizations that have already created the inclusive culture you seek. Look through their job descriptions and then leverage what they're doing as a framework to create your own internal process and JDs.
Awesome. With that, we'll move on to part two. Take it away, Mawulom.
Perfect. Thank you. And those questions were riveting, if I can say that about questions. So, what does it mean to hire the best? As talent professionals, we are often tasked to do just that. Even though there's an incredible amount of pressure to hire quickly, recruiting tends to be measured in a quality cost through the dimension of time. Hiring the best is subjective. I want to be very clear. An example of that is one of my favorite athletes is Serena Williams. And Serena Williams did not become the best by simply playing the individuals in her local communities. She fostered relationships with organizations, played local, national, and then eventually played on a global scale. And even after that, her title as the best is subjective. So with that as context, do you really have the time and capacity to hire the best? And what we do at LTSE is that we are seeking candidates that are giving us, our team the signals we require to make a confident hiring decision. And for an example being that these individuals have the skill sets, they have the desire to do the job, and they're aligned to our mission and principles. We identify the channels and communities where these individuals exist, and then we develop sourcing strategies, as I related to by the question earlier, to reach these people and share our opportunities in those communities. We started with the modified Rooney Rule. When it comes to representation, the Rooney Rule has been around for some time. It requires that we interview at least one underrepresented candidate which is depicted in red, for a role. We also require that hiring teams interview at least 2 women and 2 underrepresented candidates before we extend an offer. The empirical gap that I've observed with implementing the Rooney Rule in several startups is that unless that one underrepresented person has a life-changing interview, it's difficult to compete with the many represented candidates who are also qualified. Recognizing this led to the development of the Mo Rule. Now, the Mo Rule in practice is this. We identify which underrepresented experiences and backgrounds are missing from our team. And then we dedicate top of funnel resources to finding people fitting those profiles. And we manage our candidate pipeline to ensure that there's a 1-to-1 ratio of underrepresented to well-represented candidates in our interview process. If you've heard me speak in the past 6 months, you've most likely heard me share the Mo Rule. And the Mo Rule is named after Mr. Elalem. Mr. Elalem was a mentor early in my career. In addition to his day job, he devoted his time to developing science, technology, engineering, arts, and manufacturing programs for students in under-resourced communities. So knowing what's happening in your funnel is value added. Putting your team in a position to act on that information, that's where the magic happens. An actionable step is to measure the representation of your hiring pipeline while it's active. Be aware of the breakdown of candidates in your pipeline. Understand where they're coming from. This gives you insights into where you can double down and avenues where you're not receiving the candidate of the quality that you are expecting. Using pipeline data to drive strategic planning for top of funnel sourcing means having an action plan. And I'm going to skip to the third and then go back. And by that, I mean, we review representation data after each hire, using lessons learned to iterate our strategy. And to do that, we need to get clarity on the avenues and pipelines that are working. So by understanding where we get the majority of our candidates from, understanding candidate quality, when you're evaluating the overall pipeline data, you can then take action to increase representation as needed. We assemble a hiring team. This actually reminds me of Avengers, and I want to yell Avengers Assemble, but I will not. So we assemble a team of interviewers for each position we open. These are people with the perspectives required to qualify the skill sets we're looking for. In order to have well-equipped interviewers who understand the importance of hiring and candidate experience, we train our interviewers. We host monthly interviewer and unconscious bias sessions. All interviewers must be trained to conduct interviews. Interviewing is a privilege, and it's one that we take seriously. We measure what was retained through the training by reviewing feedback continuously and creating a psychologically safe environment to recalibrate interviews through one-on-one dialogue or bespoke group training sessions. We conduct paired interviews. What that means is that 2 members of our team meet with one candidate at the on-site stage. Currently, this on-site stage is done via video. Paired interviews allow us to gain dynamic data from 2 perspectives aligned to the same task. This provides a stronger signal on required skill sets. We design diverse interview panels specifically to obtain this type of signal. Although we're not using GoodTime currently, in my previous roles, Aaron, you're aware, we've used the tool. And there are 3 things that I really enjoyed about the tool. Number 1, it allowed us to streamline the scheduling process. Number 2 is it supports intelligent interview and selection, as well as provides a platform and an avenue to obtain real-time analytics and insights. One thing that came top of mind, and I've had a number of discussions about during the past 12 months, is relating to fatigue and fatigue of the underrepresented team members. One of the tools that I've suggested companies use to reduce this fatigue is actually GoodTime, because it allows for group tagging. This is where employees who serve as interviewers can self-identify in nearly any way they choose. This helps broaden the definition of diversity and ensures our hiring managers create diverse interview panels. It also reduces the stressors on the potentially low number of underrepresented individuals that you may have in your organization. We know diverse interview panels help cultivate diverse teams. So I highly recommend this as a helpful strategic hiring tool in your hiring toolbox. Continuing with structured interviews, our brains receive 11 million bits of information. Oh, I just got a pop-up. Was this you, Aaron? Is this a test for me?
Oh, no, it's actually, I'm pretty sure it's popping up for everyone. You can exit out of that. And then, yeah, you can continue on the actionable steps.
Perfect. This takes me a little bit into the SATs. I want to ensure I get the right answer. Yeah. When it comes to, actually, hold on 1 second. I can't see my screen now. Here we go. We're all set. Perfect. Can you all see the deck as well?
Yep.
Perfect. So as I mentioned before, our brains receive 11 million bits of information per second. As you can see, when the pop-up came up, I was not able to process and move things around. And that's okay. We as humans are only capable of processing 40 or 50 bits consciously. Thus, structured interviewing provides a framework for hiring teams to stay focused, to be consistent, and increase the chance of getting useful data points while reducing bias. And to do this, we develop and align our interviewing questions ahead of time. We then develop a range of answers for each question, and this becomes the rubric, which we use as success criteria for each question. Instead of having a nebulous subjective standard where you're feeling things out, we leverage the combined interview questions as well as a rubric to create detailed scorecards in our applicant tracking system. This helps guide interviewers and keeps them focused on task. So if they're in an interview seeking signal X and then pop-up Z comes up, they're able to remove that and focus primarily on what they're looking at. Candidate experience is a rich context. Ahryun, I saw you unmuted, so I wanted to let.
Yeah, I think this is our last slide, and it seems like we have some questions popping up. But Mawulom, if you have any lasting thoughts on the candidate experience, I would love for you to finish your thoughts, and then I'll get to the questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being so thoughtful. In terms of candidate experience, 3 lasting thoughts. 1, every interaction with the candidate matters. In our initial calls or interviews at LTSE, we aim to get to know a candidate and give them a chance to learn more about our team and the role. We walk them through the requirements of the position and the surrounding team, along with providing transparency by sharing role-specific compensation ranges. We also share a document that outlines our mission, the impact of the role, and what to expect during the interview process, as well as how to prepare. When it comes to leveling the playing field, yes, there are a myriad of tools that you can use to get insights into a company, but we all don't have those resources. So by providing this tool, irregardless of a person's disposition, they have insights into the signals we're looking for, as well as how to prepare for our interviews. It's important to note that we are not looking for a culture fit. We are looking for candidates that are going to be additive to our environment, not candidates that are expected to match everyone else in style of belief. We believe that an inclusive culture begins by bringing your whole self to work. And to do that, it's incredibly important to have a sense of belonging, as well as a psychologically safe environment to do that. Lastly, compensation. Fairness, transparency, and equity are 3 things that are top of mind when I think of compensation. And in our data-driven world, Many organizations have access to data that make it easier to do this well. When we launch a new position at LTSE, we align internally on compensation before we post a role. In the spirit of transparency, we share this compensation range for each role during our initial interviews with candidates and discuss this throughout the interview process. Every offer we share is reviewed by an internal hiring team and externally for fairness and consistency. I'll pause there as I believe the questions are mounting.
Oh, awesome. You said equity, fairness, and transparency about compensation. Love that. It looks like there are some questions popping up. The first question is actually, the question actually addresses moral. Really love the concept. You said it's a derivative of Rooney Rule. Am I correct in understanding that?
Not quite. So the Rooney Rule is something that we use in the past. The Moore Rule is something that was created and developed. Rather than it being the derivative, it's more so a, a tool that we're using. I think about the Moore Rule as a Swiss Army knife that can get things done. And I think about the Rooney Rule as a flathead screwdriver. It can do one thing. And depending on your environment, it can do it well or it does not succeed at all. One key point to the person that asked the question, if you Google Harvard Business Review on this, you'll find out that the percentage of individuals that are hired when they're underrepresented, especially women, and by this I'm referring to the Rooney Rule. When you have one woman interview for a role in a sea of individuals that identify as male, I believe the number was around 75% chance. It increases to 79% when you double the amount of individuals that identify as female. And when you double the amount of individuals that identify as underrepresented or minorities in an interview panel, this percentage chance to them of them actually being hired increases to over 100 and I think it was around 70 or 90%. And that's traumatic. And by that, I mean, if you think about all of these candidates, they're all qualified for the role. The only difference is this nuance that we're calling out.
Oh yeah, totally. And do you recommend requiring candidates to self-identify at the time of application in order to abide by the rule?
Do I recommend it? No. And by that, I mean, it's self-identifying is an incredibly personal decision. And even identifying your pronouns is an incredibly personal decision. The nuance to the individual human experience that we're all going through is that life's challenges create certain barriers, and without knowing someone intimately, it's difficult to really ascertain and suggest and require that they complete that part of a survey prior to applying for a job. Not only that, I'm confident that there are some legal and compliance issues that you may run into.
Gotcha. You said moral is basically at the on-site stage, you have half well-represented groups of candidates, and then the other half are underrepresented groups. In order for moral to actually work, then you do need some information from the candidates. Am I correct? That so you can actually categorize whether which category they belong to, so you can have that 50-50 representation.
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that you need this data to move things forward. So let's use the example of individuals that identify as women. If you've opened up a role in the past, let's say you're hiring a data scientist, and you look at your pipeline data and you realize that 90% or 75% of the individuals that apply identified as male. So when you open this new role, leveraging that information, it will be value added to build relationships with organizations that nurture and develop data science in individuals that identify as women, and share your job description and source through those pipelines. So by doing that, what you're doing is evening out the overall process. So you may not get an exact match because individuals may not self-identify, but for the most part, what you'll do is create a larger group of qualified, represented, and underrepresented folks in your pipeline, which you can then pare down to a one-to-one ratio as you're moving through your process.
Definitely. And you mentioned that, grouping your interviewers also so that you can prevent fatigue and so on. And, especially like, let's say a female candidate comes in to the interview and they meet with all male interviewer panel, that would definitely kind of turn them off. So I would think that this more rule or the rules around diversity and inclusion on the candidate side also applies to the interviewer side. Do you diversify and also diversify the interviewer panel as well so that the candidate experience matches the inclusivity and diversity that you want to represent to them?
Exactly, Ahryun. We do. We coordinate our interviews and run paired sessions so that we can have representation. That said, if you're in a small organization, if you are the only individual that identifies as female in your organization, it can become very taxing to be a part of all interviews. I mentioned this earlier regarding the GoodTime group tagging. This allows other members of your team to self-identify in so many other ways, which broadens their definition of representation and diversity. Then throughout the coordination efforts, being acutely aware of those definitions, you can then pair individuals with folks that they can connect with that may not look like them, but share the same interests.
Definitely. Awesome. So I think that's all we have time for today. I do want to thank you, Mawulom, for joining us today and for sharing such valuable information. This has been extremely informative, helpful, and very interesting. So if you want, folks in the audience, if you would like to connect with us, please find us on LinkedIn and please connect with us. And we would love to answer any questions that we weren't able to get to. I do want to thank you all for joining us today. And it's been an amazing session. I totally loved it. I hope everyone enjoyed it as well. And please take care and see you next time.
Ahryun, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining. Have an amazing rest of the week.